Imagine standing at the absolute summit of the world at just 31 years old. You look at your bank account and see $180 million, a staggering fortune minted from the sale of PayPal, the digital giant you helped build from the ground up. In the year 2002, this was Elon Musk's reality. For 99.9% of the human population, this would be the final victory lap. It is the moment you buy a fleet of custom yachts, a private archipelago in the South Pacific, and vanish into a life of permanent sun-drenched luxury. Your name would be a footnote in Silicon Valley history as a successful entrepreneur. But Elon Musk didn't see $180 million as a reward for past achievements. He saw it as a fuel tank for an impossible future. Instead of retiring, he did something that made the seasoned veterans of venture capital think he had suffered a total mental breakdown. He didn't just invest a safe portion of his wealth, he liquidated every single cent. He wagered his entire existence, his reputation, and his very sanity on two of the most unforgiving, capital-intensive, and impossible industries in human history: commercial space exploration and mass-market electric vehicles. He went all in against the brutal, unyielding laws of physics with SpaceX, and he dared to challenge the century-old, multi-billion-dollar dominance of Detroit's auto giants with Tesla. It was a gamble of pure, unadulterated audacity. But by 2008, the music stopped. The rockets were exploding, the factories were silent, and the global economy was in a violent freefall. Musk was hours away from total bankruptcy, standing on the jagged edge of a catastrophic failure that would have made him a historical laughingstock, a cautionary tale of hubris. This is the visceral story of how a genius nearly lost his fortune, his reputation, and his soul, only to change the course of human history instead. To truly grasp the sheer madness of Elon Musk's risk, one must first strip away the hindsight of the present and remember exactly what the world looked like in 2002. Today we take private spaceflight for granted, but 2 decades ago, space was not an industry. It was the exclusive, fiercely guarded playground of superpowers. Since the dawn of the Cold War and the terrifying heights of the space race orbit was the domain of nations fueled by the limitless treasuries of the United States, Russia, and China. The idea that a private citizen, a dot-com millionaire with no formal background in aerospace, could build a rocket from scratch that could reach orbit wasn't just considered difficult. In the hallowed halls of Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and NASA, it was considered suicidal. It was a fool's errand. The aerospace establishment viewed Musk not as a visionary, but as a delusional tourist. They watched with a mix of pity and mockery as he assembled a ragtag team of young, overworked engineers in a converted warehouse in El Segundo, California. He wasn't just trying to build a business. He was trying to compete with the combined industrial might of sovereign governments. To the experts, Musk was a man trying to build a ladder to the moon with toothpicks and glue. And then there was the matter of Tesla. If the space industry was a fortress, the automotive industry was a graveyard for startups. In the early 2000s, the electric car was nothing more than a punchline to a bad joke. The term was synonymous with slow, ugly plastic golf carts vehicles that no serious person would ever want to be seen in, let alone drive. The giants of Detroit, GM, Ford, and Chrysler had already conducted their experiments and reached a unanimous verdict. General Motors had famously crushed its EV1 program, convinced that battery technology was a dead end that wouldn't be viable for at least another century. The world believed the internal combustion engine was immortal, a fundamental pillar of human civilization that could never be replaced. The consensus was absolute. Electric cars were a niche curiosity for environmentalists, and space was for governments. There was no market, no infrastructure, and no hope. Yet Elon Musk ignored every expert, every cynical blog post, and every glaring red flag that screamed stop. He possessed a terrifying level of conviction that bordered on pathological. Shortly after the sale of PayPal, he took the $180 million fortune that could have secured his family's comfort for generations and began to dismantle it. He poured $100 million into the skeletal, unproven remains of SpaceX. Then he doubled down, funneling $70 million into a tiny, struggling, and frequently chaotic startup called Tesla. By the time the wires were sent, Musk was left with barely enough to survive personally. While his former PayPal colleagues, the PayPal Mafia, were moving into sprawling Bel Air mansions and buying private jets to celebrate their victory, Musk was flying commercial, living in a rented house, and pouring his remaining liquid cash into payroll. He wasn't just building companies. He was attempting to force a sci-fi future into a reality that was actively, violently resisting it. He was a man out of time trying to drag humanity into a multiplanetary sustainable era through sheer brute force willpower. For a few years, the world watched in fascinated disbelief as the sheer force of his personality seemed to defy gravity. He became the Iron Man of Silicon Valley, the golden boy who could conjure miracles from thin air. He graced magazine covers and gave TED Talks speaking of Mars and a world without gasoline. He was the visionary who supposedly could do no wrong. Under the surface, however, the gears were grinding. Musk believed he had built a sufficient margin for error. He thought his $180 million was a massive enough war chest to withstand the inevitable setbacks of engineering. He believed that even if he stumbled, the momentum of his previous successes and the depth of his pockets would catch him. He walked with the confidence of a man who believed he had calculated every variable, accounted for every failure, and mastered the odds. But he was wrong, dead wrong. He had underestimated the universe's capacity for cruelty. He hadn't accounted for the fact that in rocket science, a single loose bolt or a microscopic leak can erase years of work in a heartbeat. He hadn't anticipated that the global financial system was about to go into a cardiac arrest that would dry up every source of capital on Earth. Most of all, he hadn't realized that by trying to save the world, he had placed his own neck on the chopping block. By the end of 2007, the Iron Man was melting. The margin for error had evaporated. The mountain of gold was gone, and the man who thought he had planned for everything was about to face a sequence of disasters so total and so relentless that they would leave him with nothing but a choice: give up and be forgotten, or stay in the game and risk a total psychological and financial collapse. The bet was placed, the wheels were in motion, and the house was about to call his bluff. The descent into the abyss didn't happen all at once. It was a slow, agonizing realization that the universe was no longer on his side. By the dawn of 2008, the Iron Man of Silicon Valley was fading, replaced by a man who looked like he was haunted by ghosts. Every cent of the $180 million fortune once thought to be an inexhaustible war chest had been consumed. It had been sucked into the freezing, unforgiving vacuum of space by SpaceX, or burned away in the chaotic, malfunctioning assembly lines of Tesla. Musk wasn't just running out of liquid capital. He was running out of soul. The universe seemed determined to crush him with surgical precision. It started on a tiny sun-scorched speck of land in the Marshall Islands called Amalek. This was the front line of SpaceX's war against gravity. Twice, Musk had attempted to reach orbit with his Falcon 1 rocket. Twice, the sky had rained fire and millions of dollars of charred debris into the Pacific Ocean. Flight 1 had failed because of a single corroded nut. Flight 2 failed because the engine shut down prematurely. Each failure was a stab to the heart of the company's morale, but Musk kept pushing, convinced that the third time would be the charm. But the true nightmare began on August 3, 2008 with Flight 3. This mission was different. It wasn't just a test flight, it was a job. SpaceX was carrying high-stakes cargo, 3 satellites for the US, Department of Defense, and NASA. This was the moment SpaceX was supposed to prove it was a legitimate player in the aerospace world. The countdown hit 0. The Merlin engine roared to life, and for 2 minutes the flight was flawless. The engineers in the control room began to cheer, their voices rising with a hope they hadn't felt in years. But then at the moment of stage separation, the unthinkable happened. A tiny freak mechanical error known as residual thrust. A slight bit of extra push from the first stage engine caused the 2 stages to collide. The rocket wobbled, lost its trajectory, and disintegrated. In an instant, years of 100-hour work weeks, tens of millions of dollars, and the dreams of 100 elite engineers vanished in a cloud of white smoke over the ocean. The silence that followed was deafening. Grown men who had sacrificed their marriages, their health, and their sanity for this rocket put their heads in their hands and wept openly. They were broke, they were exhausted, and they were out of time. SpaceX had enough components for exactly 1 more launch. If Flight 4 failed, the company was dead. There was no next time. But as the smoke cleared in the Pacific, a new storm was brewing back on the mainland. The 2008 financial crisis had arrived, turning the American economy into a graveyard for innovation. Venture capital, the lifeblood of Silicon Valley, evaporated overnight. Tesla, which was struggling to scale the production of its first car, the Roadster, found itself in a death spiral. The company was bleeding cash like an open wound, losing hundreds of thousands of dollars every single week. Musk was now cornered in a way he had never imagined. He was forced to make a gut-wrenching, impossible choice. If he split his remaining dwindling cash between SpaceX and Tesla, both would likely starve and die. If he gave it all to save the rockets, he would be effectively murdering the electric car. He was playing a godlike game of life and death with the two things he loved most. And while he was fighting this two-front war for his life's work, his personal life was being decimated in the town square. His marriage to Justine Musk had collapsed under the weight of the stress. The divorce wasn't just private, it was a brutal public spectacle that played out across the emerging world of blogs and tabloids. The media, which had once hailed him as a prophet of the future, now smelled blood in the water. They mocked him as a delusional millionaire who had played with fire and finally got burned. Every financial detail, every personal failure was scrutinized by a public that seemed to relish his downfall. By the end of 2008, Musk reached a breaking point that would have shattered any other human being. He was sleeping on friends' couches because his accounts were frozen or empty. He was borrowing money from wealthy acquaintances just to pay the salaries of his employees so they could feed their families for Christmas. He was physically deteriorating, living on caffeine and adrenaline, his mind a constant loop of night terrors where he would wake up screaming from dreams of falling. He was standing at the absolute jagged edge of a total collapse, financial, professional, and personal. He had bet everything, and the house had finally called his bluff. He was down to his very last chips, standing in the cold shadow of a failure that would define him forever. One rocket left, 3 days of cash in the bank, and a world that was waiting for him to finally inevitably give up. But Musk didn't give up. He prepared for one final desperate and terrifying throw of the dice. Flight 4. September 28, 2008, Amalek Island, a tiny speck of land in the Marshall Islands. On the launch pad sat Falcon 1 Flight 4. This was the end of the line. There was no Flight 5. There were no more secret accounts to raid. If this rocket exploded, SpaceX would be liquidated within 24 hours and Tesla would follow it into the grave. The world held its breath. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, ignition. The rocket pierced the Pacific sky, a lonely pillar of light against the darkness. This time the stages separated like a choreographed dance. The second stage ignited, pushing deeper into the blackness. And then the voice over the comms broke the silence, cracking with emotion. Nominal orbit. For the first time in human history, a liquid fuel rocket developed by a private company had reached Earth's orbit. In the control room, the tension snapped. But Musk didn't cheer, he didn't jump. He just stood there, his eyes watering, whispering to himself, it worked. He had cheated death by a matter of seconds. But orbit didn't mean cash. By December, Tesla had exactly 3 days of cash left. Musk was hours away from telling his workers they were jobless for Christmas. Then the miracle arrived. NASA, impressed by the flawless trajectory of Flight 4, called with a $1.6 billion contract. Musk used that NASA deal as a lever and ultimate bluff, forcing terrified investors to stay in the game. The deal was signed on Christmas Eve at 6:00 p.m. The genius had survived his own funeral. As September 2008 approached, Elon Musk was no longer the confident, polished billionaire who had sold PayPal. He was a man standing on a thin tightrope over an abyss. The stakes for Flight 4 were not merely financial, they were existential. This was the final bullet in the chamber. The PayPal mafia fortune was gone, the bridge loans were exhausted, and his reputation was in tatters. On the tiny, sun-blasted strip of land known as Amalek Island, the Falcon 1 rocket stood like a lonely monument to a dream that was hours away from either becoming a revolution or a tragic footnote in history. The tension in the SpaceX mission control was so thick it felt physical. Engineers, many of whom had worked 100-hour weeks for 6 years without a single success to show for it, watched the monitors with a mix of hope and terror. Musk sat in the corner, unusually silent. He knew that if this rocket exploded like its three predecessors, the liquidators would be at the doors of SpaceX the following morning. Tesla, which was being kept alive by the skin of its teeth through Musk's personal loans, would inevitably follow it into bankruptcy. This was the all-in moment of the century. At 4:15 p.m., the Merlin engine ignited. A massive plume of white smoke and orange fire erupted, and the Falcon 1 pierced the Pacific sky. This time, the universe seemed to hold its breath. The rocket cleared the point of maximum aerodynamic pressure, the dreaded Max Q, where so many dreams go to die. Then came the moment of truth stage separation. The first stage fell away cleanly, the second stage ignited with clinical precision, and the rocket continued its lonely climb into the blackness. For 6 agonizing minutes, the only sound in the room was the steady, rhythmic reporting of telemetry data. Then the words that changed the course of the 21st century broke over the speaker's nominal orbit. For the first time in human history, a privately developed liquid fuel rocket had reached the stars. The room erupted into a frenzy of screams, tears, and chaotic joy. But Musk didn't celebrate with the crowd. He stood paralyzed, his eyes watering, whispering a single mantra to himself: "It worked. It finally worked." He had cheated the laws of probability by a fraction of a second. He had proven that a private citizen could reach space. But while the sky was conquered, the ground beneath his feet was still burning. Orbit brought prestige, but it didn't pay the bills. As the calendar turned to December 2008, the year of hell reached its final, most brutal crescendo. Tesla was flatlining. The global financial crisis had frozen the credit markets, and Tesla's bank account was dwindling to zero. Musk was hours away from missing payroll for his hundreds of employees. He was facing a Christmas where he would have to tell every single worker that they no longer had a job and he no longer had a dream. He spent the weeks leading up to the holidays in a state of manic desperation. He was moving his last remaining pennies between accounts like a shell game, pleading with investors who were themselves terrified of the collapsing global economy. He was a general whose army was starving, yet he refused to surrender. Then on December 23rd, at the absolute 11th hour, the phone rang. It was NASA. Impelled by the flawless success of Flight 4, NASA had reached a decision. They weren't just giving SpaceX a pat on the back. They were awarding them a contract worth $1.6 billion to resupply the International Space Station. That single phone call was the oxygen Musk needed to survive. He used the NASA contract as a massive psychological lever, going back to Tesla's wavering investors and giving them an ultimatum: invest now or we all lose everything. He bluffed, he pushed, and he struggled until the very last second. The deal to save Tesla was signed on Christmas Eve at 6:00 p.m., exactly 6 hours before the company would have officially run out of cash. The genius had survived his own funeral. But the Elon Musk who walked out of the wreckage of 2008 was not the same man who had entered it. The youthful PayPal-era optimism had been scorched away, replaced by a hardened, steel-cold, and often ruthless resolve. The year of hell had taught him a terrifying lesson that the boundary between being a visionary and a failure is a thin, invisible line held together by nothing but sheer, stubborn willpower and a refusal to accept defeat, even when defeat is the only logical outcome. People often ask why Musk is so relentless, why he demands the impossible from his engineers, and why he seems driven by an invisible internal fire. The answer is etched into the scars of 2008. He learned that to change the world, you cannot just be smart. You must be willing to endure a level of pain that would break any other human being. He didn't just bet his money, he bet his sanity, his reputation, and his soul. He stared into the abyss of total oblivion, and for the first time in the history of the modern era, the abyss blinked. Today, we see the rockets landing themselves on floating platforms and electric cars dominating every street corner. We see the richest man in the world. But the foundation of that empire was built in the ashes of 2008. Never forget, it all almost ended as a ball of fire on a tiny island in the middle of nowhere. Because sometimes, to save the future, you have to be willing to watch your own world burn to the ground. The story of Elon Musk's ultimate gamble ends here, but our journey into the minds that change the world is only just beginning. Your feedback is my greatest inspiration to keep creating. Which figure are you most curious about, or what specific challenge in a visionary's life would you like me to dissect next? Please leave your thoughts in the comments below so we can discuss them together. Thank you for staying with me until these very last seconds. I'll see you in the next journey.